It is no secret that as a nation we face enormous needs. Over 90 million Americans today are uninsured or underinsured. Almost 600,000 Americans are homeless. Our child care system is dysfunctional, and we have one of the highest rates of childhood poverty of any major country on earth. And I think we are all in agreement that our roads and our bridges and our infrastructure are in terrible shape. And in my view, we face the existential threat of addressing climate change, which could wreak havoc on our country and the world. In other words, there is an enormous amount of work that has to be done, and much of that work will be very expensive. For that reason, we as members of Congress have the responsibility to make sure that our taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and that they are spent cost-effectively. And that is true whether the issue is health care or education or anything else. It is certainly true when it comes to the Department of Defense, an agency with a budget of $740 billion, by far the largest spending category in our discretionary budget, consuming more than half of all discretionary spending. In my view, the time is long overdue for us to take a hard look at the enormous amount of waste, at the cost overruns, at the fraud, and at the financial mismanagement that has plagued the Department of Defense and the military-industrial complex for decades. And today, that is exactly what we will be doing. At a time when we have so many unmet needs in America, we have got to ask ourselves why we are spending more on the military than the next 12 nations combined. Why is it that the United States of America is now spending more on the military in real, inflationary-adjusted dollars than we did during the height of the Cold War or during the wars in Vietnam and Korea? Why is it that the Pentagon remains the only agency in the federal government that cannot pass an independent audit 30 years after Congress required it to do so? How does it happen that about half of the $740 billion annual defense budget goes not to our troops? Many people think that it does, but it doesn't, but to defense contractors, while virtually all of them have paid huge fines for misconduct and fraud while making massive profits on those contracts. As it happens, since 1995, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon have paid over $5.4 billion in fines or related settlements for fraud or misconduct. Further, I find it interesting that despite the fact that the lion's share of revenue for some of the defense contractors comes from the taxpayers of the United States, these same companies provide their CEOs and executives excessive and extremely large compensation packages. Last year, Lockheed Martin paid its CEO over $23 million, while 95% of its revenue came from defense contracts. Raytheon paid its CEO $19.4 million, while 94% of its revenue came from defense contracts. Boeing paid its CEO $21 million, while 45% of its revenue came from defense contracts. In other words, these companies, for all intents and purposes, almost function as government agencies, the vast majority of their revenue coming from the public, and yet their CEOs make over 100 times more than the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. And I think one of the issues that we have to also take a look at is the whole question of the revolving door, where many of our top military officials end up on the boards of directors of these major defense companies. Senator Grassley and I sent a letter to all three of these CEOs asking them to testify this morning. All of them declined to come. Further, as the GAO has told us, there are massive cost overruns. This is a huge issue unto itself. Cost overruns at the DOD acquisition budget that we have got to look at. According to the GAO, the Pentagon's $1.8 trillion acquisition portfolio currently suffers from more than $628 billion in cost overruns, with much of the cost growth taking place after production. GAO tells us, and I quote, "Many DoD programs fall short of cost, schedule, and performance expectations, meaning DoD pays more than anticipated, can buy less than expected, and in some cases deliver less capability to the warfighter." End of quote from the GAO. That has got to change. And let's be clear. As I stated earlier, a major reason why there is so much waste, fraud, and abuse at the Pentagon is the fact that the Defense Department remains the only federal agency that hasn't been able to pass an independent audit 30 years after Congress required it to do so. I think it is extremely important. I don't know how familiar you may be with this quote. I have to admit that Donald Rumsfeld, Bush's Secretary of Defense, was not a hero of mine. But one day before 9/11, I don't know if you're familiar with this, he made some remarks. This is what he said. And that didn't get a lot of attention, obviously, because 9/11 came the next day. But this is what he said on September 10th, 2001, and I quote, this is from Donald Rumsfeld, quote, "Our," meaning the Pentagon's, "financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track 2.3 trillion in transactions. We cannot share information from floor to floor in this building, the Pentagon, because it's stored on dozens of technological systems that are inaccessible or incompatible." End of quote, Donald Rumsfeld. And yet 20 years after Rumsfeld's statement, I wonder if the situation is any better today when the Pentagon has now received 3 failing audit opinions in a row. 2011, the Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan concluded that $31 to $60 billion spent in Iraq and Afghanistan have been lost to fraud and waste, and so forth and so on. In my view, it is time to hold the DoD to the same level of accountability as the rest of government. And let me conclude by saying this. I think everybody in this Congress and in this committee understands that we need a strong defense and that the men and women in the military and their families must be treated with the respect that they are due. But we do not need a defense budget that is bloated, that is wasteful, and that has, in too many cases, massive fraud. I hope that all of my colleagues remember what former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a good Republican, said as he left office in 1961, and I quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." And in an earlier speech, Eisenhower, remember, 4-star general who led the effort in Europe in World War II, this is what he said, quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." End of quote, President Dwight D. Eisenhower. What Eisenhower said was true then, and it is true today.